Hey there folks, welcome back to Rising Waters.
Today's episode is aimed at professionals within resilience-based engagement.
We specifically talk about engaging with hidden voices.
In an earlier episode, we heard how rural communities and farmers are impacted by flooding and how this can often go unseen.
In the future, we're hoping to cover more hidden voices, but today we talk about how we can listen to amplify and be more inclusive when engaging with our communities.
There is no one approach to engagement, so we've brought on two guests to share their experiences and perspectives, lending their insight from years of working with communities in different spaces and backgrounds. Let's get started.
We have our guests with us today. We have Gemma and we have Jatinder. And Gemma, if I come to you for your introduction and background.
So I'm Gemma Ptak. I'm an assistant director in local government, and I'm also a strategic lead for community resilience for Cleveland Local Resilience Forum.
Excellent.
My background stems right back from a bit of community development work when I was fresh out of university on a 15-hour contract, and it was working with three of the most deprived wards in a particular town, and it was using physical activity to engage and motivate communities. And back in the old school days of, I turned up to a community with a bag of kit and on a Friday night and a Saturday night and just talked to young people, built a relationship, old style, just having good conversations.
I remember those days, I must say.
Yeah, but it worked.
Yeah, it did.
So it kind of went from there, and then that was voluntary and community sector. Then I've worked in local government since then.
Brilliant. Jatinder?
So I'm Jatinder Singh Mehmi. I'm a social scientist at the Environment Agency. So my background is in environment is started in waste management, so sorting out waste, which is quite exciting. You might not think it is, but it's quite exciting, sorting out waste, looking at the composition, setting up door-to-door recycling schemes for retailers, for householders. And then I looked at sustainable development at a regional and national level, and climate change, again at both the regional and national level. And now I'm a social scientist, and I think I've also done a lot of work in the voluntary and community sector for the last 40 years, and I think that's really helped me quite a lot, understanding different perspectives, understanding things from a cultural point of view, social, religious, educational point of view. So I think that's something that I try to bring into my work in terms of trying to understand people as well.
Yeah, it's all about building that social capital as well, and being a part of that. It's great. I think it's great work. Brilliant. So kind of getting into it with the sort of main topic of today. So what I wanted to kind of capture to begin with was, what is a hidden voice exactly? Because we can kind of say these things, and so lots of different people that's going to mean very, very different things. And so what are your sort of experiences with hidden voices, and sort of what do you understand it to be?
I think we've often referred to hidden voices as hard to reach, which I've always really struggled with that term, because I don't think anybody's hard to reach if you find the right way of reaching and engaging them. I think hidden voices, it's about representation. How do you make sure everybody's got fair representation and fair opportunity to access, engage and be part of I think decision making. I think that's the other thing I would kind of want to point out. I think we often use engagement, we use consultation, we use a range of terms, and sometimes it can be a little bit tokenistic, whereas for hidden voices, it's actually ensuring that we can get to everybody, for them to see something important in what we're engaging them about, and also to empower them and support some shared decision making. Lots of terminology used now around co-production and co-design and things like that. And I think that that's where we're moving to, is actually it's a shared responsibility. But yeah, I mean, there's many hidden voices.
Yeah, definitely. How about you?
Yeah. Just building on what Gemma said, I think hidden voices, it's an interesting term because they've got a voice, but through the processes we put in place, that we don't actually capture those voices. And when we talk about hidden voices, I was thinking about, we're not capturing their perspectives, their views, their thoughts. And so sometimes the processes, the engagement processes, the consultations create that hidden voice. They're not hiding these communities on purpose. So I think it's something that we need to capture that. And exactly as you said, Gemma, trying to be a bit more inclusive. And I think that can be at an individual level, it can be at a community level as well. So, individual and
bringing in that kind of being mindful of those differences as well, and bringing that to the sort of as a very first thing, bringing that to the table to enable that conversation as well.
And I think sometimes we get caught up in what's important to us as professionals at times.
Yes, yeah.
And because we see it as important, sometimes it's how do we relate to where other people just really don't see it as important? Often people are hidden or hard to reach because there's a barrier or a challenge preventing them from accessing that engagement opportunity, or they're not seeing it as a priority. They're really kind of seeing other things as a priority first and foremost. So we've got a job to do to be quite creative with our approach and thinking about how do we make it relatable, because it might be important to us, but actually it really isn't always important
and
to
I
others.
guess there you've just touched on some of them barriers. So would you care delve in and tell us a little bit more about what them barriers are, either why we're maybe not engaging with them or vice versa and they're not engaging with us?
Where are the barriers that we might put in?
Yeah, I think there's a range of things. I think the thing with engagement is it can't be you do the same thing every time with every group. It's got to be you approach engagement very much kind of centered around that community, that person, that topic. And so it's got to be thought about quite differently. So the barriers will perhaps always be quite different. There's some very kind of fundamental barriers where we talk about access, be that digital access. We're moving in very much a digitized world. And actually there's a really high percentage of people that we identify as hidden voices who do have access to digital technology, but they perhaps don't always have access to sustained connectivity, for example, or they prioritize their connectivity for them to apply for jobs, apply for benefits, or if it's more vulnerable communities, they might do their online shopping or whatever that might be. So I think, there's fundamental barriers linked to things like digitization, and lots of our engagement is now digitized. The other thing is environment, where do we do engagement? And often we try and bring people to a central location, but actually people more comfortable engaging in their own environment because they feel more open and more inclusive. So again, that kind of that location. And I think the other one is educational attainment. If we look at the language that we have, I've been doing a lot of work on this. I have responsibility for adult learning and skills. And when we're looking at our local and national literacy levels, they are primary school age, and that's where a lot of our literacy levels sit. And if you put some of our literacy through some software, which we're all being kind of playing around with at the minute, some of our kind of communications were coming out at age 20. Well, when we've got an average reading age at primary school age and, materials are coming out at age 20, that's a huge barrier because people aren't going to want to engage with that at all.
Yeah.
So there's some really key, barriers that we need to think about that are quite basic.
Yeah, definitely.
I think there can be barriers as well in terms of the individual as well. So if they've got disability, or so their cognitive ability or physical ability, like you're talking about, Gemma, to visit places for workshops or consultations, or they might be neurodiverse. So some it might might benefit some people in terms of some digital sort of consultation, but some people might be wary because I'm speaking, there's issues of trust. What am I saying? How's it going to be used? And there's things like that. And then there's like elderly, they might not have the capability to to attend, or they might have other needs. So your own sort of physical characteristics can actually, I never call them barriers, I just call them challenges. We all have different challenges. If you've got a young family, you might not be able to get out to some of these consultation events. You might have a different lifestyle where you're working in the evenings. Your shift patterns might be different to everybody else. That might change things. Or might be that you just haven't got the time. If you're on low income.
Definitely.
And I think one of the last thing is trust, which I'm sure you've probably looked at. When an organization comes and talks to communities, if there's no trust there, or if you're speaking for the first time, how do you engender that trust? How do you get them to speak to you? Are they thinking there's an interior motive there? How do you develop that relationship? And it takes time to develop relationships. It just doesn't happen straight away.
Yes. Yeah. I think there's a really great project called the Relationship Project, actually, and it's about that non-transactional nature of relationships. And I think we are guilty now of living in a sort of, we have a purpose, like you mentioned earlier, we have a purpose. Here it is. That's for you. We've done our job. Let's go. And it's not always that cold, and there is always that sort of restraint on sort of resource and things like that kind of stops people from taking that extra step to make sure that relationship wasn't transactional. But it's about, I think for people who maybe don't work in engagement, and quite a lot of time engagement is something that is on the operational level and very rarely thought about on a strategic level. There's a sense that's really tangible, and I think that step between those two things can really be felt when there's a deadline or something like that. And sort of we have the engagement folk who are kind of really picking up that they need to do more, they need to go different places, different times, and making sure that things are accessible. And say for what would normally be one consultation, really should be doing 3 or 4 that are in different locations, that are near bus stops, that are near, train stations, or having some other and different times, and just understanding that. And it takes a very long time to organize that. And some of the projects that we get through have such a strict deadline that you just can't. And it's I think we need to actually think from a strategic level how to include all of that.
I totally agree. And I think even just having some dedicated resource to do that, because I think that's the risk. We probably don't do it as well as we could because it is very labour intensive. And I think it's back to the point you made there in terms of impact. We want to quantify everything, and actually good engagement is about good conversation, and good conversation can't be quantified in the way that we would like to see it. It's not data, it's not information that can be comparable. It's good information that gives representation of communities, and that can only happen through good conversation. And I think it's who's doing that. It's back to the point we made earlier in terms of trust and relationships. Us as public sector, we do lots, as local authorities have responsibility to do lots of things around housing, around social care, around welfare and benefits. So if we're wanting to engage with people, but they have something going on in their life that they might be worried about in terms of social care or welfare or housing, they'll be reluctant to engage with any part of a local authority because they're worried that whatever they might say could be used. And that's not how local authorities work, but it's a perspective that people have. And we find working with voluntary and community organisations where people have a lot of trust, they have good relationships, and even just some of that peer consultation, actually key community champions being the eyes and ears to be able to give representation to individuals because there's trust there. People are giving them the reality of the situation. So I think it's really difficult to approach. I think the other thing we've got to be careful of is engagement fatigue, which we all want to engage. And it's a real, as I say, around co-production, co-design, it's a real thing that people are now taking much more seriously. But actually, you've got all of your public services doing that, all of your voluntary and community services doing that, you've got businesses and commercial services doing that. Everybody wants to know what everybody wants. And so therefore, everybody, you have it now, you'll do a transaction online and something will pop up, let us know how we did. So, whatever that engagement is, we all want a part of it. But actually, at the end of the day, there's a person or a community at the end of that going, oh, not another one. And how do we collaborate better on engagement, which I think is a really big priority for us all moving forward. And I don't think we do it as well as we could now.
Definitely. I think we've we've tried to try and answer that with external engagement networks. So I know within our sort of line of work, we've got I'm putting a flooding lens on it. We try as best as we can to try and let each other know where we are at any given point, so we can kind of, we're going into that community, we're in that community with the week before, can we do something together instead of going in twice? And not in a sense of it's very similar work, so it's not necessarily consultation, but also how can we use those two things? So if we do need to go in twice, what can we tailor to that message, and what can we tailor to that, and how can we work together? And it's kind of nice in the sense that we've gotten to the point where we're kind of like, let's engage as much as we can, but equally, that fatigue is something that is really felt, and I can feel it going into communities because they kind of look at me and go, right, okay, what are you here for?
We had this last week.
Or and
repetitiveness,
and it's a little bit. It's difficult as well because you don't want the community to turn around and look at you and think, oh, you're not as connected as I am because you haven't heard this guy's come around to talk about your subject, and that you're talking to me about it now. So it's you want to seem hold that information together to build that trust. But Jatinder, anything to add to that?
I think, Gemma, you just mentioned the sort of community representation, and that's something that I'm always quite interested in, because you could get somebody representing communities, but is their voice a representation of that community, or is it just one voice that's representing? So I'm a Sikh, am I just representing myself? And it's a Sikh voice, or is my Sikh voice a representation of that community? And the latter takes a lot more effort. And so, so the person themselves can isolate the rest of the community and not be very, very representative themselves.
Yeah.
And I think, and that's a challenge. And, how do you sort of qualify that? How do you know that they are sort of representing, those diverse voices? Because even within communities and ethnic communities, there's diversity within them. Yeah. And we just seem to think, oh, well, this is the Muslim community, the Sikh community, or this is another community, well, they must all have the same opinion, but why should they have the same opinion? There's diversity within that.
Yeah, definitely.
And it just shows that how complex, communities are. And I think, but I think one of the things we can do now, we've had the census 2021 data that's come out on the Office of National Statistics, and that sounds very complicated, but it's not really. The ONS has produced some really simple tools to actually understand, if you're looking at a community, how many lone parents are there, how many people in rented accommodation, what's the population in terms of their age? Is it a predominantly elderly population or a young population? Are there healthcare needs? And then that can play a part in then how do we need to do our engagement? And who are we capturing? Because, you were talking about quantitative sort of metrics for engagement, which are still are useful. Then there's the qualitative bit, the richness of that conversation and who's saying what. Is everybody having an equal voice? Does everybody feel listened to?
Yeah.
But the quantitative side, I still think there's a big opportunity now. The census, most of the data is out. So we can look at a particular community and look at its characteristics and really understand. Actually, we've got a high population of renters in this. So it might be more of a transient. What connection do they have with their environment? What connection do they have with their community? Because their feel of a community might be very different to another community where you've got 40% of the people that are over 65, and their connections might be very different.
Yeah.
So we can get into that sort of nuanced sort of thinking about communities and engagement. And
yeah, no, I completely agree. And actually, I had a very recent experience there's a great website called Street Check, and that does a great job of quantifying the ONS and kind of putting it in a way that's very useful for engagement experts. And we actually changed a project's engagement plan off of the back of that, because there was an assumption that there was more of an elderly and more of a family orientated engagement that needed to happen there. And actually, we found that it was an overwhelming amount of students, and it was very transient. So we had to actually change we had to flip it on its head, really. But I think one of the dangers that I noticed in that, looking up those ONS statistics, is that you can kind of, if you're a professional who's looking for a way to engage, you can slip into a very dangerous area where you see an overwhelming amount of representation in one and go, oh, well, that's where I'm going to focus my engagement, and then completely miss the 1 or 2% that's actually really important. So I think it's worth looking at and making sure that that if it is present, that it's given equal value, if that makes sense, and not just the percentage of the value.
It's got to be proportionate on where the vulnerability exists. Yeah. Sometimes the data, you could have just 1% of a population that's very vulnerable because of healthcare needs or something, but then that 1% becomes quite important in a flood, because then their ability to cope, prepare, to respond might be very, very different to other people.
Yeah. And I'd like as well to go back to a point that you mentioned before, and how it's so important to have these diverse voices included in these conversations and things like that. I guess, what do you feel are some of the biases or things like that stop us hearing from these diverse voices and stop them being within the conversation?
I think there's from both sides. It's from the organisation side, and then there's the people side. So we've got biases, unconscious biases, conscious biases. And, we have to just listen. It depends if we're just there. If we've already made a decision and all we're doing is getting it rubber stamped and we just want the opinion of that community, then it's not really, is it a consultation? Is it a dialogue? I don't know what you think, Gemma. Or is it, I think, so it depends on where, what point are we engaging? Are we saying that we want to co-produce or, co-create something?
And I think that's probably one of the risks, is sometimes people interpret it as quite similar things, but they are very different. And I think kind of consultation is where we probably have something that's quite well defined, quite well developed, and we want to let people know this is where we're going with it for any final amends or tweaks. Yeah, I think so. In some respects, I think that's where we get to. And there are situations where we need to do that, because actually there's, all the things we've just mentioned there around kind of information and intelligence. Sometimes we are very well informed, and it depends what we're doing. But I think it comes back to managing expectations, because sometimes I think community engagement can often then give an insinuation that something will happen that's possibly quite different to how communities have interpreted it, or how some of the more heard voices have kind of said it. And I've had lots of experience of that, but sometimes there's quite technical approaches, or there's national policy around it, or there's legal responsibilities around it. So therefore, although the community engagement may give some insinuation to something being different, actually it can't be, because there's got to be kind of technical and professional interpretation of what we need to do within the kind of boundaries of our work. Whereas when things are more around, we want you to support us to develop a solution, or to understand how we solve a problem, it's a different approach. So I think it's about managing expectations, because often we go out and perhaps we'll say it's an engagement piece, but then actually what we're doing is probably giving them quite a final piece of work to say,
yes,
any final comments on this, and then people think, oh, I'm quite aggrieved that you haven't changed that when we felt so strongly about a certain aspect. So I think it's us starting to be quite clear with the definition of what we mean when we're going out to engage with the community. And that's got to be set out in that plan, in that kind of preparation.
And maybe not even using engagement, but kind of using the of what it is. It's a meeting to discuss this, and to let you know, rather than communication.
It's a communication piece. If we're sharing this with you, so that you are aware that this is what's going to happen, or this is what it is, and actually, that's okay. We can do that. We've just got to make sure that we're really clear when we're starting that process, that that's the intent.
Definitely.
There's two key words there, isn't there? Transparency and process. So right at the beginning, just being transparent. This is what we're here to do. This is part of a process. This is how what you're saying feeds into the bigger picture of what we're trying to achieve.
I've seen some great sort of more recently, probably the past couple of years, I've seen more projects engage earlier and capture more voices just through practice. They don't always get it right, but they're doing sort of better and better every time they go back. And I've seen some wonderful sort of inputs from the community as well, and different perspectives that are being captured. I would still say it needs work, but I think there's just going back in and just being unafraid to actually ask that community and sort of be careful with our unconscious and conscious biases, but also be make people aware that we have them, and say, I'm not from that background, I would love to hear more about what you've got going on, and being a bit brave and sort of asking that question. I think it can be really difficult especially if you have a large, well-known sort of organization or government body. I think it's difficult to admit that we haven't got that right. We'd really like to come to get it right, and I think we're getting better at it, but it's definitely a challenge.
I think people's starting points are very different, aren't they? When you talk about a topic, and sometimes you have to build capacity within that within that community about, this is what we want to talk to you about, even before you talk to you about it. And like you're saying, set that context about the policy framework or legislative framework that we're working within.
I think that's a really good point. I think that kind of baselining of where are people starting, because even, we're using the term resilience a lot. People have no idea what that means, no idea. And actually we've got to start from a place that then we're kind of educating people to understand what it is we're trying to do. So I think that's a really important point when we're looking at engagement. Where are people starting? And actually some communities are quite well understanding of what we're trying to do, and quite well educated, and it's not about missing them out, because they'll still have a perception that we really need to interpret within our engagement piece. But it's definitely something that we should do a little bit better.
Definitely. And I think I would love to go just sort of circling back to inclusive engagement and kind of why sort of we place such quite an importance on this, and I think it's I think for us it's really important to bring forward sort of, and I'm trying to think about the best way to describe this. So why is it important to bring people to the table, and what kind of effect can it have when we do? It's probably a good sort of discussion. I wondered if you have any thoughts on those.
I think it's important because we don't know what we don't know, and only by bringing a range of voices around the table from a range of experiences. We've not touched on lived experience. Lived experience in all of this is so critical because we can only really relate through experience, and they are individuals and they are communities that can really bring to life an issue, and actually that encourages more engagement,
100%.
because that motivates people to think, wow, I can really relate to that because I have also a lived experience. So I think the importance of diversity in anything that we do brings a range of perspective that then even that conversation itself, one person saying something which relates to another, it creates a richer discussion, and it actually gets us to a better place in relation to whatever the solution might be, or whatever the things are we need to think about. And sometimes I've come out of engagements and you kind of go, wow, okay, that's probably identified another 20 engagement pieces that we need to do, because we need to delve deeper into that and deeper into that and deeper into that. And it's, you can't go on forever, but actually once people start having those rich discussions, especially where people have lived experience, you think, wow, okay, we really need to think about these things in a bit more detail.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so I guess tailing back to the point we've just discussed about why it's important to bring these voices to the table, but how we have these barriers and things like that in place. So Gemma, you touched on earlier about like kind of the literacy and things like that. So I guess a massive thing is having these language barriers and literacy barriers. What are some of the things we can do to improve that and get messages across to people who may have these barriers in place or challenges, as Jatinder said earlier?
I think it's got to come from the communities again. I think we've got to work with communities to be able to understand how we do that, because I think what we're at risk of is sometimes overcomplicating, because we're thinking about everything. We don't want to create offense to anybody, and we don't want to make the wrong assumption. And sometimes it is just quite open, to say, how would that work for you? Is it written format? Is it communicating with you verbally? Is it a different mechanism? And people are actually really open to say that really wouldn't work for me, or this would really work for me. Sometimes it's quite challenging for us to think, can we accommodate that? So I think it's difficult again to make assumptions on how that works. I think in terms of, it's twofold. We're doing the engagement piece, so all of our engagement needs to be accessible and inclusive. But I think one of the things we really need to think about when we're engaging is that holistic approach. If people are really translating some of these quite strong barriers and challenges, or some of the risk to them as individuals in terms of why they're not resilient, how are we connecting them with things that might help them in the long term? So actually literacy levels, there's opportunity for them to connect with people, to support them around their literacy. Is that something that is good to do at a point in time when we're engaging them, so that actually in the future they can be more engaged because they're able to kind of develop themselves? And there's got to be a timing around that. We can't just go, oh, thanks for consulting about this really kind of, high risk topic in terms of flooding. I've noticed your reading age isn't very good. By the way, can we offer you some literature? It's got to be timed. There's a time and a place to give people an opportunity, but that's where it's about good conversations and understanding where we can go with that.
I guess that is a big thing of it. It's like you don't want to offend anyone, but sometimes you're doing more offense by if you're not asking them questions, and then you're not offering them the support that they need. So definitely, 100%.
I think communities, and you'll know this, Gemma, I think people, when you're genuinely trying to engage with people and they see it as a genuine thing, even if you make a mistake, they're quite forgiving, aren't they?
Absolutely.
So I think, and I think that really works. I think that the other really important point that you made was about asking the communities themselves, how do they want to be engaged with, what works for them. And, we have sectors like health, education, housing. They all probably have the same challenges. So how have they overcome that? What mechanisms and, ways of engaging and communicating and, getting people around the table, or maybe not around the table, because sometimes the table is just a psychological thing. It sounds very formal, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How many times do people sit around a table to talk about these types of things? So looking at alternative ways, looking at using trusted community members, trusted people within the community, maybe that, working through them, or trusted organizations.
Yeah.
So if within a community, if you've got an organization that deals with neurodiversity, well, why don't we work through that organization to talk about neurodiversity and what's the best way of engaging with them? What would make them comfortable? Yeah. What are their challenges? And then that organization would, for that specific group, they would know how to do that. And going back to the table thing, like arts fairs, crafts, there's all sorts of festivals, lots of organizations are seen there, like the police and, there's lots of careers fairs, or there's other types of things that, we have to just think a bit more sort of imaginatively.
Yes.
And not just using written word, it's about arts and visuals. A lot of people are very visual.
Yeah.
You talk to them for 5 minutes, they won't have a clue. You show them some visuals and some of the practicalities of what we're trying to do. Actually, we're trying to increase flood resilience and then show them some images, and that sometimes is a bit more powerful, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel the same. I think there's a bit to be said about art and sort of how that can sometimes transcend any kind of bias, and because a lot of people can relate with art because they see it in their own way, right? So there's a lot of things we're kind of entering into that area a little bit within our engagement, and we're just kind of we've taken that brave step of just doing it, and now we've had it on so many times that every time we kind of adjust it, we didn't quite capture that, or someone's given us a great bit of feedback about how they would love to see it, and that art piece, it can be visual, so it doesn't have to be any words being said. It can be I think I would love to give a great nod to Theatre Space for this. They do this as their daily bread, and they call it clowning because you don't, or miming, because you don't have to have any words, and you can have this really great sort of visual. It's about your body movements and things like that, and how you display that, and everyone can relate to that because we're human beings, and we can read each other. But there is still things to be mindful even in that space, and I think art is a great way of doing that, definitely. And I think just creating, and like you said, being present at those events and being present at a diverse amount of festivals as well is important, and just getting out there and having the conversation and
how do they capture information?
Yeah,
because there are community hubs all over, lots of different communities. They communicate in lots of different ways. You might have a group that looks after sort of green space, and that might be a good way of capturing them and then using that. You have all sorts of cycling groups. You have all sorts of different sorts of community hubs. You have focal points for communities, like you have places of worship for communities. And those are great places for getting all sorts of information. And, usually you have to just say it once and then everybody knows about it by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because, information just transmits like that. So how do you have to just understand the dynamics and the way communities actually work. And a lot of them actually just work by talking, don't they? They don't actually use digital means.
I was going to say that I think sometimes we've got to consider how formal or informal we engage. I engage all the time. I go out and about to services. I get the joy of seeing, lots of wonderful projects. And when I'm there, I don't stop talking. And that's me engaging. And I'll ask questions and I'll understand. And then people will give me some feedback. And I might then think, I'll ask a couple more people about that. And so I'm not structuring a consultation or an engagement piece there. I'm just gaining information to give me some insight to think, what do I do with that? And so sometimes I think we overstructure because we want a process and we have a timeline and we have a date and we have, and that's really important because that, gives us opportunity to access a range of materials to engage. But sometimes it can be a really informal piece, and lots of the kind of mechanisms you mentioned there in terms of festivals and community events, and it's just about going out and about and understanding what's there. And I think the other big point is how do we let people know that this is for them? Because I think we always assume when we do an engagement piece that everybody knows that this is for them because we've given them enough information that they should know they're the person we want to hear from. And sometimes people see it, and I've done it before as somebody that lives in society. I've looked at something and gone, oh, that's it me, you know, I've probably got nothing that I can contribute positively towards that, so I just won't do anything. So how do we get that message of knowing that it's for them? And that, I mean, you know, a great project that I've kind of been fortunate to be aware of is LGBTQ plus communities, and also working with, I think, Migration Northeast, communities that don't typically engage with culture and arts, talking about the kind of creative sector. So we've done a really great piece of work called Stories of the Sea with those communities, because they don't see themselves as having a place in museums or having a place in art galleries because of, you know, perspectives, and their perspective of those spaces, and perhaps their perspective of how inclusive they are. And there's been a really great conversation, a really great project that's developed of saying, but this is for you, this is for everybody, this is absolutely for you. But we've had to make that really quite explicit, and then again really think about how do we make ourselves more inclusive and more accessible. So, you know, I think it's about how do we let people know that the engagement is for them and that they should be part of it.
And it is about that, like going back to what we said before about representation, and just seeing you and seeing yourself having that conversation, a part of your identity there as well, and opening, and us as, you know, professionals or whoever's working in that capacity to think about that and put that at the forefront and have that conversation. Because if someone's like, oh, it's not, you know, if it's not for me, like, well, it is, I can tell you how, and, you know, and kind of maintaining that.
I think it can be a big challenge, can't it, for somebody to feel that they belong in that space? Because it could be quite formal. If I turned up with a suit and a tie, and, you know, you've got members of the public, and they might not feel that, you know, I'm not articulate, I won't understand what's going on, I don't want to embarrass myself, you know, I might not have anything to say, I don't really understand, you know. And so I think it's about how we, like, through the engagement, the dynamics as well, you know, not everybody can stand up in a group of 100 people and talk.
No.
You know, even professionals find that nerve-wracking, you know. So how do you design engagement? You know, it might be small groups, might be a carousel, you know, you've got to look at different ways of doing that, because we're just used to working in that way, aren't we? You know, we go to big meetings and conferences and, you know, do lots of Teams calls and things, and that's quite normal, but our normal isn't normal for a lot of other people, is it?
Definitely.
No. Yeah. And I think you can see that, you definitely see that when we do surveys, we look at trying to make them anonymous. So when we try and capture them in person as well, so where we can, when we're engaging, we kind of say, oh, you wouldn't mind filling this out, and we try to give them as much privacy as possible as well, because we don't want to be kind of looking over their shoulder like what you're writing, and, you know, and we want to be able for people to be able to feel like they can say what they want to say without having to be identified either, and have their personal, like, you know, the personal things come across without having to necessarily be like, I have this agenda. And I think it's really important to give that space, as well as it is to bring people into a group conversation where they can be seen if they would like to be seen, and perceived. And I think being perceived is probably one of the scariest things if you're not used to it. And, you know, being in that public space, especially, I mean, even asking people to come onto this podcast, they're like, is it going to be recorded? And, you know, and you just think, you know, and yes, but obviously, you know, it has limited the amount of people that have wanted to come on, and you know, so we have other ways of capturing that later. But it was one of the things I didn't even think about, because I was like, oh yeah, of course everyone would be happy with being recorded, you know, and actually they're not always. So.
It's like Jatinder spoke about the, like, speaking of a room full of 100 people. I'd find that nerve-wracking.
Oh God, yeah.
I'd feel very uneasy about that. So it's totally understandable.
Yeah,
and definitely. I think the other thing, Gemma, you just made me think about was, you know, why should people engage? I think it's about making it personal. What are the benefits? How does, not even maybe how you might not benefit, but how does your community benefit? You know, so how does your neighborhood, how are you helping other people? How is it going to make whatever we're looking at better? And I think that personal, sort of emotional, you know, human beings are very emotional. A lot of our decisions are made on a emotional basis.
Yes.
So, you know, so bringing that slightly different type of language in is really important. You know,
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that emotive connection is really important, and I think people have to see the benefit. and they have to see the importance. If they don't see that, then it's not worth their time. And you know, we've started looking at some of this within the work we do around community resilience. And you know, one of the things was we were trying to engage with businesses, you know, which are a really important community. But actually businesses, you know, time is money. You know, they are commercial, they are working hard, they're doing wonderful things. And for them to engage in something that takes time out of their day, they have to see an importance to that. So it would have, you know, I think we were looking at just, you know, almost a mass communication. And it was, no, we really need to strip that back to be more personalised. We need to ensure that it's really clear. And I think as well, one of the things that I've done before is giving people an option. I think I've done it where we've done a survey that might be, you know, a number of questions that might take 10 minutes. But then it's what's really important in that information. And then we've extracted 4 questions, which is a short survey that would take 3 minutes. And then it's saying to people, well, you know, it's 3 minutes, it's 4 questions. And to answer these questions, it would be really great for us because of, but it would hopefully be really great for you because of. And you're given that kind of that rationale. And hopefully people then think, well, 3 minutes, I can see a benefit. I understand what they're saying. Okay. But the 10 minutes, 20 questions or whatever it might be, people go, that's not for me. But I'm still gaining some really important information there. So again, it's about that differentiation. How do we make it different? And even just using visuals, you know, we talked about creativity before. I think being more creative and innovative with how we engage. And I've done it many a times where it's just Post-it notes on a piece of flip chart when people are leaving the room. You know, Frayer, you attended the workshop that we kind of ran. And I'm a really visual person myself. I really struggle with a huge amount of text. So it's lots of, you know, interactive. If you feel comfortable to, if you're happy to share it, it's a quick Post-it note, it's a quick comment, it's ticks on a smiley face, a sad face. You know, it's lots of different ways of us thinking creatively and being innovative in respect of what we want to do and achieve. And I think sometimes we've got to really think about what we're going to do with the information that we gain. I think sometimes we over ask, and I think we've got to really be concise with thinking, how am I going to use this information? Why is this information important? Do I really need it? Or I'm going to collect it and it's going to sit somewhere for just in case I need it. And then do we prioritize a little bit more?
Yeah, definitely. And having sort of that communication with them as well, and just understanding sort of this is the important information. However, I am going to take this note away because I think it might be important at some point, you know.
I think the important thing you just mentioned there is connection. Once you make a connection with somebody, then, you know, you've got them on your side, haven't you? And then it just flows, everybody's relaxed. And it could be about anything, you know, just, it might be just the way the room's set up. It might be just, you might have some tea and biscuits to start with. You know, so the first 10 minutes of a consultation is just everybody just gets to know each other. You've got a name badge, so you're not awkwardly trying to talk to somebody. And then, you know, you're just easing people into a process. And then you start more of the sort of formal process.
Definitely.
And once you've got that connection, and even hearing from people within the community first, so you're getting their slight endorsement. You know, they're not, they might not completely agree with what you want to do, but at least you're saying that actually getting someone to say this is important. We really need your views. That might be much more powerful than somebody that's just like, if I've just come along and so who's this guy that's come along is trying to say it's important, but they've got a connection with that person, they're more likely to believe him. And, you know, they've got, it might sound more genuine, even though it might be genuine, but you know, it just sounds different. So just those subtle things that make a difference.
It's that thing, at the end of the day, we're all human and not one of us is more important than the other. We're all there.
No matter what we do. Or what we,
biscuits and cakes are
it's the great equalizer.
Ingredients, I think.
It's the simple things.
And I think it's showing vulnerability. As professionals, we aren't programmed to show vulnerability because we're presenting ourselves in a professional context. And I think sometimes, you know, we have to make ourselves vulnerable, and that's a risk. You know, I've done it before. You know, I have lived experience around certain things that would connect me better with certain communities or on certain subjects. And I often think I don't want anybody to see me in a vulnerable way. But actually some of the better conversations I've ever had, or some of the trust and relationships I've built have been able to connect with people on a vulnerable level because I've given them enough to show that I have a level of understanding. I'm not just doing this through a transactional, process, I'm actually connecting with you because I really genuinely understand.
Yeah.
And not everybody can do that. So it's not about, I think sometimes people think they might make themselves vulnerable, but actually it doesn't always relate. It's thinking about, will it actually relate? And therefore, is it worth making yourself vulnerable?
Yeah.
But
it's part of good leadership, isn't it?
Yeah.
Vulnerability, trying to be genuine, be open.
Yeah.
But it's quite a difficult thing for people to say, isn't it? I don't understand. I don't have the answer to this. That's why I'm here.
Yeah.
But then, you can always get the pushback. Well, this is your job, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think we'll close it there. I think we've had a really, really great sort of discussion and covered a lot of things. I think we could talk about this forever, and hopefully we can. But yeah, it's great to have you on. Thank you, and thanks for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you both.
Yeah.
Great
Nice to meet you. And you as well, Gemma.
Thank you.
This episode of Rising Waters was made possible by all of our partners and volunteers. Make sure to check out the show notes or description for this episode to learn more about what you heard today.